We are so pleased to see so many of you joining us today. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for your attention, and welcome to our call. NASA is pleased to host our valued colleagues from the National Endowment for the Arts. And today's session will be about changes to the endowment's fiscal year 21 partnership program guidelines. Our endowment colleagues, the incomparable Michael Orlov, Andy Mathis, and Cliff Murphy, will walk you through guidelines changes in just a moment. But first, I'd like to take a moment to share that it's been an absolute honor to work with the endowment team, especially these past few weeks, and particularly in response to the pandemic. They have moved federal bureaucratic mountains to advance important and timely work. And their work related to the partnership program in particular was undertaken with a focus on your best interest and the best interests of those people you serve. Also, your work across state and jurisdictional arts agencies has been incredible. We're really proud of it. We see your strength, your resiliency, and your tenacity. And all of that will continue to serve you well as you take on any challenges that may lie ahead. So thanks so much for everything you're doing. I hope you know that your work is indeed benefiting communities all across the country. Now, back to federal guidelines changes. I'm confident you'll notice productive changes and real streamlining that reflect your input to the endowment. And that's a hallmark of our relationship with the endowment. Ours is indeed a partnership. You will also notice changes that signal new opportunities for state arts agencies, particularly in the area of folk and traditional arts. And Cliff Murphy will explain that a little later. For now, I'm pleased to pass the baton to Michael Orlov and Andy Mathis, who will get the conversation started today.
Thank you, Pam, and good to see everyone, although I can't see everyone on my screen. I can see about half of you, maybe. We appreciate this time, and let me first say I hope everybody is doing well in these challenging and turbulent times. I have to say these Zoom calls, although we all complain about being on so many Zoom calls, it is great to be able to see everybody and connect. I'm currently sequestered in my bedroom because there's multiple things going on in my house that involve Scrabble tournaments and dancing very loudly. So hopefully you'll be able to hear me and not what's going on outside of my bedroom. So let me first extend a hearty thanks to the NASA team, Pam and Kelly and Sylvia and everybody, Eric, for hosting this. We have spent a lot of time talking with our NASA family this entire year, but certainly a lot in these past couple months. And I want to say thank you, especially to Pam and Kelly and Sylvia, who spent a real solid 2 or maybe even a 3-hour epic meeting with us when we walked them through all the changes we wanted to make, and their feedback was invaluable. This process was really initiated for me when I first started this position back in April of 2019, which seems like about 10 years ago. I admittedly hadn't read through the partnership guidelines prior, and so one of my first tasks was reading through the guidelines. And as Andy will recall, on a epic ride back from Charlottesville later that month, we started on this journey of refreshing not only the guidelines, but also the review process. That was by far the most productive road trip I've ever been on. And I couldn't have asked for a better person to be on it than Andy. So we started on this journey of changing both the review process and the guidelines. And lost the screen here. Oh, there we go. I also want to extend a sincere thank you to Andy, who has been absolutely invaluable in this process. Also, Jen Eskin, who is on this call, our division coordinator, and Ali Fogel, our division specialist, for digging in super duper deep on this. And of course, to Cliff and Cheryl Sheely and Aaron Whaler for their willingness to dive into uncharted territory with all the changes we made. And then as I'm extending gratitude, I want to finally thank so many folks on this call. You may recall we had a very open dialogue with many of you at the NASA Leadership Conference in Providence, which also feels like that was about 10 years ago. And you all provided such great feedback and suggestions for us. And then a number of you participated in a couple of conference calls that provided further direction. This is all to say that the changes reflected in the new guidelines are not just the work of Andy and I and our partnership team, but really the work of many and many on this call. So sharing my gratitude. And let me also just note that we always welcome your thoughts and feedback and suggestions. So while extensive changes were made this year, we are always open to more in the future. Our guiding principle since we started the process was really, how do we make this, these guidelines, this process more user-friendly for the state arts agencies and for the regional arts organizations. So getting into the changes, one of, at least the first for us, was navigation. And while we don't have the most dynamic website that allows for all kinds of high-end capabilities, I think we are going to have one of those websites soon, but that's not the case now. We wanted to provide some, improvements to the guideline navigation. So you will notice, and if you've gone through it already, you'll see that new, the word new, NEW, has been attached to all the places on the guidelines that are new this year. And one thing that's new is each applicant organization has its own path, which wasn't the case in the past to follow. So if you're a state arts agency, you can follow your own path rather than all being lumped into one. And we feel like it makes it easier to find what you have to submit and answer, which questions only pertain to your particular group. The second, I would say, primary change was the streamlined review criteria. The review criteria in the past was 3 sections. We've condensed it to 2 sections, which focus on the planning process and the implementation and accomplishments. And Jen and Andy will remember, we spent a good chunk of time trying to discern between what is actually part of our legislation and what is just existed for so long that we thought it was part of our legislation. And we really focused the application review on how the plan was created and how it was implemented rather than directly on the plan itself. And that is pulled off of what we are required to ask you to provide rather than what has just existed for a very long time. So we hope condensing it to 2 sections is easier for everybody. And again, we look forward to hearing folks' feedback after we get through this particular fiscal year. The third primary change was better alignment of the narrative questions and review criteria. They've been structured differently, and you'll notice for on-year applicants, the narrative will be split into 2 sections that correlate to the review criteria. And some of this really came out of that session that we had in Providence, where people asked, very straightforward questions that made sense and were not necessarily evident in the previous guidelines. So the planning process, for the most recent planning process, detailed recommendations resulting from the public meetings and metrics that influence your most strategic plan, and implementation and accomplishments, including your priorities, significant programs, activities, and accomplishments, and investments. In recognition of the varied types of work applicant organizations are involved, we welcomed hearing about activities across broader subject areas. And so we added some language, and I'll just read it. We urge applicants to discuss accomplishments in arts education and underserved communities, as well as other areas such as folk and traditional arts, equity, physical and programmatic access, diversity, preserving cultures, technology, military, healthcare, social services, rural aging, youth, housing, and community development. This is not to say that you can't go beyond those particular subject areas. These were merely just suggestions and just expanding what we see as really developing across the different state arts agencies and regional arts organizations. The last change, and this is really an addition rather than a change, is that Poetry Out Loud is going to be expanded in the 2020-21 school year. It's hard to say 2020-2021 school year when we don't even know what that's going to look like, but will be expanded to Guam and American Samoa. So they will be participating next year. So those are the basic changes that I wanted to talk about. And I wanted to leave plenty of time to answer questions, but I mainly wanted to hand over the virtual microphone to my colleague Cliff Murphy, because a great deal of changes were made in the folk and traditional arts and the folk arts partnership portion of the application. And I'll just say again, I really enjoy working with Cliff and Aaron and Cheryl and that whole team. This process really was wonderful to work on internally between our two divisions. We literally sit 8 feet from each other, and you'd be amazed on how little we actually see each other. It was really nice spending time going through all these changes together. And I think it's going to be really, really great for the folk and traditional arts field. So I will turn it over to Cliff.
Thanks, Mike. And I'll just say under normal circumstances, we do sit close enough so that I could hear Mike groaning over his first read through of the partnership guidelines. And, I just want to say thanks to our colleagues at NASA. Thank you, Pam, for your enthusiasm in embracing these changes, and to Mike and Andy and the partnership team. And also, I remember prior to coming to the Arts Endowment, I've been there for 5 years. I remember the annual terror of when I worked at the Maryland State Arts Council, of trying to weave my way through the partnership guidelines to find all of the things that I needed to answer for folk and traditional arts. And so it's exciting to see some changes come to that portion of this. And I hope that everybody finds this to be to their liking. So thanks, Mike. Before we get into the nuts and bolts, I want to acknowledge the great work being done already by 50 states and regions with existing programs. Your tireless work in connecting grassroots cultural organizations to NEA and SAA and RAO funding over the past several decades is reflected in the data behind our Office of Research Living Traditions report, which came out late in 2019. This report shows that folk and traditional arts is our agency's most effective tool for reaching the nation's most rural and most poverty-bound communities. That report has prompted some changes in our partnership guidelines, which reflect a renewed commitment by our agency to supporting folk and traditional arts, what we often call the state folklife programs, in every state, territory, and region. So looking directly at the guidelines, on the main page of the partnership guidelines, you'll see the following. Folk arts partnerships. Support for stable, outreach-driven programs that are responsive to a state's diverse folk and traditional arts heritage. It can strengthen state or regional support of the folk and traditional arts. States and regions are encouraged to support professional positions in support of the folk and traditional arts. Programs also may include, but are not limited to, field work to identify and document underserved folk and traditional artists, apprenticeships, mentorships, or folk arts and education programs, and statewide activities that increase public awareness of living cultural heritage. And Mike mentioned that, throughout the guidelines, there are a few things that are stamped new. So new. Previously, both SAAs and RAOs and nonprofit organizations working in cooperation with their SAA or RAO were eligible for folk arts partnership funding on an optional and competitive basis. Beginning in fiscal year 21, all SAAs and RAOs will receive some level of support for these types of activities as part of their partnership agreement. Those SAAs and RAOs that do not have the capacity for an in-house folk arts partnership program are encouraged to partner with nonprofit organizations to undertake this work. Nonprofit organizations are no longer eligible to apply directly for partnership funding. So they can receive funding in partnership with SAAs and RAOs, but they cannot apply directly. So this change reflects that folk and traditional arts is a priority of the Arts Endowment. Support for the folk and traditional arts is specified in our enacting legislation and has always been an important aspect of our mission to support the full diversity of the artistic heritage of all communities within the United States. As alluded to earlier, the 2019 Living Traditions report shows that robust SAA and RAO folk arts programs attract more grant dollars to their host states, particularly in impoverished and rural communities, and in heritage art forms that would not be reached or served or supported otherwise. Stronger support of state folklife programs from the Arts Endowment intends to encourage stronger commitments to these programs, deepening NEA, SAA, and RAO investment in our nation's most underserved areas. The efficacy of these programs in serving our hardest to reach communities is resulting in an increased level of support for these programs and in the expansion of these programs to all 62 states, territories, and regions. We're excited about this change, and we hope that you are too. So at least 12 SAAs and RAOs right now do not currently receive any folk arts partnership funding. Obviously, that will change under these new guidelines. We encourage each of those 12 SAAs and RAOs to reach out directly to us so that we can work with you on your plans for developing a new program. And we can connect you to other SAAs and RAOs that have navigated this space in a variety of ways, from hiring an in-house state folklorist position, to partnering with a nonprofit or university partner, to contracting somebody to conduct a fieldwork survey or stakeholders convening so that you can gather information on how to best develop a responsive plan. And I'll add to that, that in the last 3 years, we have done this kind of work with at least 4 state arts agencies and RAOs who have developed and rolled out new programs in phases. So there is a good recent track record for doing this kind of work. So getting into the actual nuts and bolts of the application, both states and regions will find one overarching question with 4 bullet points underneath it. So new, describe your organization's plans to support stable, outreach-driven programs that are responsive to your state's diverse folk and traditional arts heritage? So that's the big overarching question. In answering that question, you'll want to address each of the following bullet points. The first, note how you'll support folk and traditional arts in your state or region, including any grant programs, such as apprenticeships, fieldwork, research, technical assistance, and cultural sustainability programs for traditional artists. If your organization does not currently have a folk and traditional arts program, describe your plans to develop a program in phases over the next 3 years. So, for those of you with existing programs, whether they're in-house or in partnership or in development, your answers for this should be fairly straightforward. Specifically, those of you who are partnering with nonprofits or universities already, you will want to refer to your partners as how or one of the ways you support folk and traditional arts. You want to delineate your agency's grant making related to your folk arts partnership program. For example, most states and territories have apprenticeship grant programs. Some also have project grants to nonprofits or fellowships, etc. Okay, so bullet number 2, describe your outreach to folk and traditional arts stakeholders, artists, community leaders, folklorists, other organizations, etc., to facilitate field building and to inform your organization's programming or activities. So what we mean here is twofold. In an ideal scenario, organizations are utilizing best practices, carrying out field work, and are facilitating gatherings that in person or virtually that strengthen relationships between stakeholders, that's organizations, artists, folklorists, etc., and inform agency policy. So while we know that visiting with tradition bearers at community events in their places of practice, developing trusting, responsive relationships is the ideal, we recognize this may be beyond your agency's capacity at this time. In those situations, we strongly encourage the development of partnerships or contract positions that will extend your resources to hard-to-reach communities, while also fostering stronger cultural understanding and funding equity in the process. Bullet number 3, describe your staffing plans to support your proposed activities. For SAAs or RAOs that partner with a nonprofit organization to carry out this programming, or who contract out this work, describe how the partner will undertake this work and note any agreements that are in place. So again, you'll want to delineate those staff positions in-house that manage your folk and traditional arts programs, whether they run the program or the point of contact for partnerships, as well as any partnerships or contracts you have in place to carry out this work. You'll see that we encourage you to, quote, note any agreements that are in place. Best practices show that state arts agencies and regional arts organizations who work in partnership with a nonprofit or university have MOUs in place with clearly outlined deliverables showing those activities the two organizations do in partnership together. This is not required by us, but it certainly demonstrates a strong, transparent commitment and plan. It's also of great use to incoming EDs at SAAs or RAOs or at folk arts nonprofit partner organizations so that they can understand clearly what their institutional partnerships are about. So bullet number 4, describe the extent to which you'll match the partnership funds received from the Arts Endowment to support your proposed activities. So this is a pretty straightforward bullet, but it also helps us to learn more about the investment SAAs and RAOs actually make in folk and traditional arts. While we require a 1-to-1 match at minimum, there are a number of SAAs and RAOs that provide a match greater than 10-to-1, including some that are greater than 20-to-1. So previously, SAAs and RAOs were only asked to show the 1-to-1 match. This new question will help us to understand how deep your commitment is to this program, but it will also help us to understand the fullness of folk and traditional arts programs nationwide. So in answering the big question above, We encourage you to structure your answer in response to the bullets. Be clear and specific. Respond directly to each of the bullet points. If you break down the bullets, you'll see that we're essentially asking you this. 1, tell us about your program or plan in broad terms, including grant programs you have, such as apprenticeships. 2, how do you communicate with, visit with, and build relationships with traditional artists, cultural communities, and traditional arts organizations or professionals in your state? 3, who actually does this work for you, for your agency? Is it staff positions, contracts, partners, etc.? And then 4, how much do you invest in this program? So remember, all SAAs and RAOs will receive some level of support for folk arts partnerships. However, the stronger the plan, the stronger the likelihood that your agency will receive the fullest level of folk arts partnership support. For those 12 states and regions that are not currently receiving folk arts partnership funding, we do not expect a fully fledged program to be developed by the September 30th deadline. Your answers to the narrative questions will likely focus on planning and development of a folk arts program in phases. So just to recap, our intention here is twofold. 1, to ensure that folk and traditional arts is supported in every state, territory, and region of the United States. 2, to incentivize the support of thoughtful, robust, outreach-driven folk arts partnership programs. So with that as an overview, I want to say thank you to our friends in the Partnership Division for working with us on this, and to NASA for facilitating this call, and to Pam for your enthusiasm for the expansion of folk arts partnerships at all states, territories, and regions. And thank you to many of you on this call who provided important feedback and insight to this process. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have or that you have for Mike. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Michael, Cliff. I think we're going to start with those of you on the phone. I know that Michael is going to kind of go through you. If I see there are a few of you are just dialed in through the phone, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, those on the phone, and let you go ahead and ask your questions. Just give me a moment as you'll hear things unmute. Does anyone have any questions? While we're waiting, I'll go ahead and answer a question that's come through chat. And for those of you online, feel free to send through chat if you'd like. Cliff, this first one is for you from Karen Hanan. In Washington, we work with our Humanities Council in partnership for our folk arts program. We have both received NEA funding each year. The question is, with the change, so only ArtsWA can receive funding, can we anticipate increased funding to ArtsWA that will equal or better what we received with 2 orgs applying and receiving funds?
So that's a great question, and thanks, Karen, for asking it. So what will change is not, so Humanities Washington will still be able to apply to us directly for project support. They will not be able to apply for folk arts partnership support and project support. So they can receive folk arts partnership support through the Arts Council to do that work in partnership together, and they can apply to us directly for project support. And so for some organizations, some nonprofits that have applied directly for folk arts partnership support, they have had an opportunity for 2 bites at the apple in a year. And so that's the piece that will change for the nonprofits. So nonprofit partners who are working in partnership with state arts agencies or regional arts organizations will still be able to apply to us directly for project support. So in grants for arts projects, what they will no longer be able to do is apply directly for folk arts partnership funding. They will still be able to receive folk arts partnership funding if they are working in partnership with their state arts agency, but those funds will travel through the state or regional arts organization. and Andy, you are the ultimate translator of all of this information. So if anything I'm saying in folk arts speak needs translating, please, by all means, jump in.
You got it all right, Cliff.
All right.
And if any of you have questions at this point, please feel free to unmute your phone and ask them, or send me a chat message. If you prefer, you can also use the little reactions button on the bottom and the little clapping hand, and I will find you and unmute you on my end.
So I will add that one question that I've heard from a number of people, it's so funny. So Troy Geist, you just asked this question as I was about to volunteer it. So there had been some concern that we were expanding folk arts partnerships to all 62 states, territories, and regions without expanding the overall pool of funding. I just want to assure you that we are expanding the overall pool of funding in accordance with the expansion of this program to all 62 states and territories. And so one of our goals here is to make sure that organizations, that longstanding folk arts partnership programs are not going backwards in their funding levels. And our goal long-term is to increase overall support, average grant making for folk arts partnerships. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Cliff. It looks like we also have a question from Sue Jens about the folk arts component. Will the folk arts component of the application be reviewed separately from the rest of the application, as in like 2 separate panels?
I'll give my version, and then Mike.
No, go
actually,
ahead.
Mike, why don't you go first, and then I'll follow it up.
I was just starting to type it in the chat box, but thanks for the question, Sue. There will be one review process, which is obviously different from years past, but there will be one singular review process of the overall application that includes the folk arts component. Cliff, if you want to add on to that.
Yeah, so we'll have, in the reader pool, there will be people with folk arts expertise, which I'm sure will be reassuring to folk arts directors on this call. Part of the reason that we wanted to move this so that all of the readers of the partnership applications were seeing the entirety of this, was because we felt that we wanted all of the reviewers to be able to see the work, kind of the full spectrum of work that is happening in folk and traditional arts. And I think that while the peer review process for folk arts partnerships worked really well in some ways, the system that we had previously, it did sequester these programs out of view from essentially the rest of our colleagues in the arts. It's our feeling that this is problematic and really hides the dynamic work that these programs are doing. And that was unintentional, but we hope that this rectifies that.
Great. And I have a question. Actually, there are a couple questions related to this. Cliff, what does that mean for folk arts in terms of on and off years? If we're on an off year this year, what do they need to do?
And I think Cheryl just answered part of that question in the chat box. Thanks,
Cheryl. Got that on the question. Yep. Thank you, Cheryl. I didn't see your answer.
And Cheryl, if you want to jump right in with your answer verbally, that'd be great.
Okay.
Or I guess for Rena,
okay.
if there's an additional part of that question, please let us know.
Yeah, I was just answering Rena's question, which was where to find the on-year instructions. And I think when you look at the way that it's set up now, the off-year is first, and then it goes to on-year, and then on-year has several more bullet points and sections And for the folk arts section, it's under the B section and looks like bullet point 3. And then the question, I think, about where, if you're an off year, you would follow the instructions. Perhaps you're in the process or in your second year of receiving funding or third year coming up. And so what's new is that you'll need to follow the bullet points. You'll still need to answer those under the off year instructions.
And I see a question from Sandy Shaughnessy in Florida. And Sandy, based on recent events, it seems like so long ago that that I saw you in Florida. The last few months have altered my perception of the passage of time. So you asked if you would collaborate with your colleagues at the Historical Resources Folklife Program, who historically have been the people who have applied directly for support for folk arts partnerships. And we would encourage that. I think that will, and many organizations have already been doing that in some ways. So I think that makes sense. And if you want to ask us more questions off to the side, in that respect, we'd be happy to answer them.
And I've seen a couple of seconds and thirds for this question, so I'm going to go ahead and ask it. So is there no longer a need to submit a program or project budget? Or do they just kind of wait and see how much they're able to get? I think that's directed at you, Cliff.
Yeah, that's true. Yes. So for at least the last 12 years, there's been a short budget form that Folk Arts Partnership applicants have had to complete. And this is where, the intention there was to create a budget form that was easy for kind of a quick form. It wasn't really intended to be a comprehensive budget form. And it was intended to capture the one-to-one match. And I think over time, what that did is it gave this really skewed perspective to reviewers of what folk arts partnerships were doing. So if you were requesting $50,000 of funds, then your overall budget looked like it was for $100,000, even if the program was a $500,000 investment. And so we felt that panelists, the budget didn't always square with kind of the scope of the narrative, and it caused a lot of confusion. So we're just hoping that this streamlines that process for you.
Great, and it looks like there's a follow-up question. Will there be an opportunity for dialogue about capacity of the State Arts Agency to more actively cultivate programming relative to the amount that they might be assigned?
Absolutely, yes. I think that, Cheryl and I both throw ourselves with great enthusiasm into this work, but this is our job. And so please, we have been working with these programs or in these programs for 15 years or so. And so we've seen a lot of different approaches to this kind of work, developing these programs, scaling these programs. And so we are happy to offer insight, suggestions, or to connect you with people who are working in a similar capacity and with similar challenges that we may know.
Michael, I've got one for you. I have a question that's not Folklife related. So they'll be completing an on-year State Arts Agency partnership application this year that requires strategic planning. But with the difficulties of conducting the planning at this time, is there flexibility in how much of the strategic plan they're able to complete during the grant?
Thanks, Eric, and I think that's from Heron here in DC. Flexibility seems to be the key word that probably gets mentioned every day in every phone call and Zoom call since COVID-19 began. So absolutely, we're all going to have to be flexible, and in terms of conducting your planning and research and how you connect with the community, a lot of that's going to have to be done virtually, or all of it's going to be done virtually. So yes, there will be flexibility. And I would say that if you have further questions, certainly circle back with me and or Andy. But we're all going to have to look at this with a flexibility lens until we get out of the situation we're in. And please, Andy or Jen, if you have anything to add to that, but I think that's the best response I could give right now.
Great. And Cliff, I know you answered this via chat, but I'm going to go ahead and ask it out loud because I think there might be a couple other SARETS agencies out there with this question. If we give artist fellowships in the traditional arts, would that be including this, even though the endowment does not allow fellowships as used for funding?
So my understanding, I tried to answer this as best as I could in the chat. My understanding is that that's yes with a caveat, which is that there would need to be some sort of a public output from those fellowships in order for it to be eligible for funding. Which Andy, you...
Yeah, I'll chime in here and say that in the partnership agreements in general, if a state arts agency is going to fund an individual, it can't be just based on the quality of past work. It has to be for some sort of a project that has an activity to it. So in the case of the folk arts fellowships, there may be a teaching or a learning activity, or there may be a public performance, but there's got to be a real project involved.
I know that a lot of apprenticeship programs have kind of an end of apprenticeship period of performance, or a symposium, or some sort of public reflection on the process. So that it can take a lot of different shapes. Maida Owens, I see that you ask an important question here, which is, we use NEA partnership funds for the folk arts staff position now. Should we continue doing that? Yes, please. So, you know, and I think the answer to that is, you know, I think these are funds that are intended to be used in the manner that your agency needs to use them to actualize their folk arts program. And so that that can be a staff position, it can be an additional staff position, it can be a grant program, it can take a variety of shapes. And so, yeah.
I had a question come in to just me, Cliff, but this one's obvious for you. Can you describe how folk arts dollars are awarded? Basically, how are you at the endowment going to avoid the paradox of awarding large folk arts grants to agencies that already have resources or staff versus investing larger folk arts grants in agencies that need or want to build up their programs?
I understand the paradox there. One of the things that we are committed to is seeing a folk arts infrastructure nationwide that is strong across the country. And this is part of the thinking strategically in expanding these programs to all 62 states and territories. It's our feeling, and this is something that that we've heard very loudly from a lot of colleagues in the field, that an infrastructure that is weak in big pockets of the country isn't good for anybody. And so these programs need to be strong. So we're committed to supporting new and emerging programs. I know that that's not the most scientific answer, but this is something that we do take into account when we're allocating funding.
Great, thank you. This is a question for both Michael and maybe Andy. It's from Melody. If a state arts agency has conducted its strategic planning process 3 to 4 years ago, will this negatively affect scoring in that area? If it's a concern, can the state arts agency add their additional follow-up efforts to engage its constituents post-strategic plan to help meet the goals specified?
I can start by saying that state arts agency planning cycles do not have to synchronize with the endowment's 3-year application review cycle. So whatever is appropriate for a state arts agency strategic planning is up to you all and your boards. We have some states with 5-year cycles. We have one state that has a 10-year cycle and does 3-year mini cycles within those 10-year cycles. So it's really up to the state and what's appropriate for its planning cycle.
Michael, do you have anything to add?
Nothing to add. We also know that we have changed some of the, some of what's in the guidelines that don't necessarily correlate to people's cycles with their planning. And, again, we're going to be flexible, but there's going to be, there will be no negative reflection in the review process whatsoever. And Andy, correct me if I'm wrong, but we also allow for the states and the regions to even submit updates to us, as the year moves along, and we always add that to the review process as well.
Absolutely. And Melody also asked whether they could include other opportunities where they were engaging constituents to help update a plan. And absolutely, take advantage of every meeting you have with constituents to feed into your planning process. It doesn't have to be a formalized planning meeting that's billed as this is our planning meeting. You can gather input throughout the year.
Great, thank you. And Cliff, I see Troy asked a question that I'm going to ask you to answer out loud for those who are on the phone as well. Troy asked, so every state, territory, and jurisdiction will receive a set amount, but will there be a portion above that that is allocated on a competitive basis, much like I believe the arts education component of the partnership grant is set up?
Yes, that is true. And so again, the idea here is that we want to incentivize commitment to these programs. We know from decades of this work that that these programs excel in reaching hard-to-reach communities because people are doing in-person outreach, because people are visiting with communities, because people are spending time on kind of the cultural turf of constituents around the state. And so, while we want to see folk and traditional arts supported in every state, region, and territory, we also want to incentivize that kind of commitment to really diving into this work. And so those organizations that kind of in those bulleted answers are kind of showing those levels of commitment and support to these programs will be receiving additional funds on top of that basic set amount.
Great, thank you, Cliff. We have about 10 minutes left on this call, so I want to make sure that everyone who has had a question gets a chance to ask a question. Again, you can send it through chat, or if you want, you can just unmute your phone and ask directly. And a third option is provide a little clapping hand and I'll unmute you from here. So I'm going to give you just a couple seconds to see if there are any more questions out there. Great. It looks like we have a question that's come in from Janet Stark. Do you think this can actually help us in Virginia to better formalize a folk arts program? And kind of in partnership with their humanities peers?
if I'm understanding the comment from Janet, yeah, I mean, our goal here, our wish here, our intention here, and I think something that is achievable is that this kind of new framework of support can strengthen institutional partnerships and can also, we hope, break down some of the unintended sense of competition between organizations that are really working in similar pursuit within the same state. I think it's important that we don't create a dynamic in which, or we don't perpetuate a dynamic in which a small amount of funding creates a scenario where there can only be one folk arts organization that serves the state. What we want to see is multiple institutions become more invested in this work. We want to see institutional partners become stronger. So, Janet, to your point, actually, I won't say to your point. For those states and regions that have worked in partnership with nonprofits, if you have an interest in our facilitating a conversation just to help you and your nonprofit partners get together, we're happy to do that if that is at all useful or desired. And we've done that with a few states already who have reached out to us for that. So.
Great. We had another question coming about off-year application narrative. Is it still limited to 1 page in length, or will that be expanded to accommodate the new or additional narrative information on folk arts programming?
For now, it's 1 page. That was not adjusted in the guidelines. We'll see what happens with this round of submissions. You never know what could happen in subsequent years.
Yeah, and if I could just add, as we're getting close to the end, even though we made some significant changes, and again, kudos to so many people on this call, this isn't the end. If there are changes that you think should be made that you also think are possible, shoot us an email, give us a call. We are certainly open to making more changes, obviously not right this moment, but as we move into the guidelines for the following year. And also to say that the NEA is supposed to get a new website that is a bit more dynamic. And I think some of the changes, I recall from our very first meeting, Andy actually drew a navigation board on some sheets of paper, and God, would it look good in a really nice website. It's not going to work in this website, but we do have plans to make it a bit more dynamic once we get a new website.
And back to the page limitation, we did add 2 pages to the on-year narrative because of the new folk arts information.
I have a quick question from Indiana Arts Commission. For those of the state arts agencies are experiencing budget cuts in fiscal year 2021, would it be beneficial to provide context related to the impact on possible implementation of their current plan or planning efforts?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, and sorry for the short answer, but by all means, share whatever you think would be relevant and helpful, not just in the review process, but for information for us to know. Even though we're constantly calling Pam and her and her team to find that information out.
Cliff, do you want to go into a little bit of detail about possible other resources that share different models of state traditional arts programs?
Sure. So one of the fruits of this work in in working closely with NASA has really been that we've identified there's a real need to collect best practices for the field, and to really consolidate information that gives the field broadly, that gives broadly a sense of how programs in different contexts build folk arts partnership programs. I will admit that, I got started in this work interning at the Mass Cultural Council, and then worked in the state of Maryland for 7 years. Both of those states are densely populated. It takes about 3 hours to drive the distance across of it. There's pretty significant state support historically. And even in that situation, running a folk arts partnership program, you're spread pretty thin, right? And in my time at NEA, visiting places like Utah or North Dakota or Arizona, different contexts, California, the scale of states, the challenges that each state has to run and support programs based on what they have to work with, is different in every place. And I know that you all know this already. I'm sharing this so that you're aware that we know this, and this is part of what informs our policy here. And so being able to pull this information together, to work with NASA, to survey the folk arts partnership programs for information, this is something that is going on right now. We'll be sharing out some of this information at the NASA conference virtually in the fall, but this will also be an ongoing resource that we're developing. And so some of this will be rolled out in time, and I think that I think that there's more good news to come in that respect in terms of that resource. I do want to say that it's also just been pretty remarkable to see the value that that nonprofit partnerships have added to those states that don't have or haven't had in-house programs. And so we have really deliberately worked to develop a scenario where those kinds of partnerships can continue to be supported, and not just supported, but to be strengthened in the states, in many states where they have been so very beneficial. So we want to thank you for kind of forging the way in that respect. And again, these changes are intended to strengthen those bonds rather than to be a disruptor.
Great, and it looks like we have 1 minute left. So Andy, Michael, Cliff, if you have anything else you'd like to say, please feel free to. Otherwise, thank you all. Thank you, Cliff, Andy, Michael, Pam, everyone on the phone today. This has been a great phone call. I appreciate it. It was so good seeing so many of your faces on here this afternoon. I really appreciate you taking the time. If you have any further questions or comments, please feel to reach out to us and just let us know. Thank you all. Have a great evening.
Eric?
Yeah, go ahead, Cliff.
Can I just add one last comment, which is that just personally, it feels very good to be able to do this work with such strong support from NASA, from our chairman, from our other discipline directors, particularly in partnership at the Arts Endowment. I think that this is an important time for folk and traditional arts as a field, and so I just want to say thank you to everybody on the phone on this call for being so supportive of this important work. Thank you.
And yeah, just to add my thanks as well, I was going to end by saying all compliments and happiness send to me and Andy, all complaints, criticism send to Cliff.
Nice.
Thanks.
Thank you all.
It's really wonderful to see your faces. We miss you so much.
Thank you all. Have a good
Indeed.
evening,
Bye, everyone.
everyone.
Bye-bye.